bear in mind we are in middle April now. 1,000 grain weights on seed are high this year, so guys are really going to have to start increasing seed rates to try and get those tiller numbers up and try and get to 1,000 shoots come harvest time. So you're looking at seed rates probably somewhere north of 12 stone an acre for some of those bigger 1,000 grain varieties.
A very brief dry spell at the end of last week allowed many farmers to catch up with some critical tasks. On many farms, this was planting, and on others, it was applying disease control and growth regulators. But for many, it was both. However, there's still a significant backup in critical tasks on most farms at the moment. Which tasks will you prioritise when the weather improves? You're listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We would really appreciate it if you could listen, follow, and give us a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcast from. I'm joined again today by Ciaran Collins and Shay Phelan, both tillage specialists in Teagasc, to discuss the agronomy of crops and which crops are in need of attention first. Shay, despite the very wet spring, crops are continuing to grow. What's the typical growth stage of winter wheat at the moment?
From some of the figures we got from advisors around the country last week, crops were at somewhere on growth stage 30, 31. I presume they've moved on again, or they have moved on probably to strong growth stage 31 in a lot of cases this week. Despite it's cool today, but I mean it's been relatively mild over the weekend and that. So crops are moving on, so they're kind of around that growth stage 31 at the moment for most of certainly the early sown crops. Some of the later sown crops might be a little bit more backward. And I suppose if you look at them at the moment, I mean, there's a kind of a tale of two crops out there at the moment. There are the crops that got early established and probably got fertilizer there, probably, in middle of March, somewhere around there, towards the end of March. They're looking pretty okay at the moment. But some of those later sown crops are the crops that just didn't get fertilizer maybe until early April. Those crops are looking quite hungry at the moment. And I suppose the management of those is going to be slightly different at this moment in time from what I can see. I mean, those later sown crops, those ones that are hungry at the moment, typically you would normally put a growth regulator on those crops around now. They're a little bit under pressure at the moment, so I think we need to wait on another week or so until they start to green up again, and before we put a growth regulator on them.
So Shay, is there many of those crops out there, do you think?
There's quite a few of them, Michael, and it might not necessarily be down to when they were actually sown. It's actually when they actually managed to get fertilizer. Some of the heavier, wetter soils, people weren't able to travel on them up until early April. With all the rain we got in March, they just physically weren't able to travel on them. So they were kind of anaerobic in certain circumstances, that were just lying in water. So some of those crops are backward, and we're just going to have to treat them as being backward and treat them with kid gloves at the moment.
So what you're saying is that we kind of want to let those crops green up before you
yes, and probably in a lot of those cases, Michael, as well, they probably will need to get their main split of nitrogen before the growth regulator, which is kind of unusual that you need to have those crops growing good and well before you put the growth regulator on them, because it'll only drive them back even more. So they probably need to get their main split of nitrogen probably at an earlier stage than the earlier sown crops, if that makes sense. But those earlier sown crops now probably are due their main application of nitrogen at this stage. They are at growth stage 31, so they need all that nitrogen out to grow on through April.
So Shay, are you saying that all winter wheat crops, for the most part, are all in stem extension? They probably all need to be brought up to good 75% of their nitrogen?
Yes, exactly. So typically around now, mid-April, you generally put on about somewhere between 100 and 120 kilos of nitrogen on those crops now, somewhere between 80 and 100 units. So that needs to go on whenever the weather dries up, probably next week. And I suppose the other thing, just to be careful with it, crops as well, and guys driving through, there are a lot of soft patches in crops, and there are tram lines that are starting to get very, very deep already. So guys need to be careful going through these crops as well.
So Shay, we often talk about growth stage 31 as kind of a critical growth stage in winter wheat in terms of PGRs or putting a growth regulator onto it. Some of those hungrier crops might even be reaching that kind of point at the moment. And if we're going to delay an application to those crops, what are the options after growth stage 31? What does a farmer do?
Well, I mean, you still have the likes of your modest type products, so look, they're still fine. If you go on really late, then on into if we're kind of going to push it out to near the flag leaf stage, you can use like turple and stuff like that, provided you don't have a contract for mushroom growers. So I wouldn't be panicking just about growth regulators yet, especially on those later sown crops, because they are that little bit more backward. So they probably have a little bit of time yet, growth stage wise.
So go back to the modus one then Shay. So what are we saying? Modus can be used to growth stage 32, can it? Is there a mix that you use? Or?
So you can use your typical Cycocel modus mix. So you're looking at 0.2 of modus and a litre of Cycocel, which is a common mix that a lot of people use on crops at this time of year, and that's fine. There's no problem using that.
Up to 32, is it?
32, yeah. There's no problem using that, and that's a very popular mix, and most people are very comfortable using that on wheat at this stage. So it's a very flexible mix.
And Shay, I had a farmer telling me the other day that he reckoned that the third last leaf was out in his early, I think it was about the 10th of October sown winter wheat.
I think that's probably a misread, Michael, to be perfectly honest with you. I would say at this stage of the season, we're talking now the middle of April, it's more likely it's leaf 4 that they're looking at. And quite often that can be a mistake when people are dissecting out crops or plants to have a look and see what leaf is there. Leaf 3 typically comes out the end of April, not the beginning of April. So it's more than likely leaf 4 is what they're looking at the moment, or what they're seeing at the moment.
Okay. Ciaran, can I bring you in there? What's wheat looking like down in Cork at the moment? I noticed there wasn't a huge amount of it planted, but for that to stare, what's it looking like?
Yeah, albeit, as you say, a lower acreage this year, certainly. A little bit of a mixed bag again, I suppose, maybe something similar to Shay. You have a range of sowing dates. We have from some of those early October ones where there was a window there. They're quite advanced looking. They'd be 31, an odd one hitting 32 at this stage. And then we have, a small bit that was sown there in early November. And then there was some winter wheat varieties sown there in that fine spell at the end of January and early February. Those ones are just starting to tiller at this stage. And as we know, they're going to be quite a while before they reach stem extension. But I suppose the one thing I would have noticed really is just the level of disease, albeit it's not something, septoria wise that we'll be dealing with until, leaf 3 there at the end of the month. But certainly, quite a bit in crops, but I suppose the weather has sort of favoured that in recent weeks.
And Ciaran, when you're talking about that, should people be thinking about or planning that they're going to use some of the, I suppose maybe the better chemistries is probably maybe I don't know if that's the right or wrong way of putting it, but maybe the more expensive chemistries, the likes of Revisols or Univox or some of those kind of ones. Should we be thinking about that? Or
I think so, Michael.
Yeah.
No, look, wheat's a valuable crop, and look, we know from controlling septoria at this stage, the likes of Revisol and the Univoc would be, I think at this stage really is the only show for good wheat crops. I think the critical part of it though is timing. That leaf 3 fully out and obviously a flag leaf as well. I think that really determines a lot of the success or failure really of disease control in wheat at the moment. And then obviously from an anti-resistance perspective, getting a multi-site like Folpet in with them, I think really that's the crucial part, I think.
Okay, so dissecting those plants, getting the leaves out, but as Shay was saying there, correctly identifying whether it actually is leaf 3 or whether the flag leaf is still wrapped around the head or not is probably really crucial in that. And start planning your, I suppose maybe better fungicides, have them in stock, because I suppose it looks like a tricky kind of season. How about barley, Ciaran, down your part of the world then? How's that looking?
Yeah, okay. I suppose the thing with barley and the same with wheat, I suppose really nearly every field you go into, there's some little poor patch or that just a symptom of the wet weather we've had over the winter and obviously into lately as well. So I think that's a feature. In terms of management, a fair percentage of growers at this stage, I would say, have the first fungicide out, but not all. Certainly the weather has just been difficult. We had a few dry days there at the end of last week, but we kind of hit with wind, so that kind of delayed. So there's certainly crops out there with no fungicide. So that's going to be a priority there. And then I suppose in terms of growth regulation, I mean, look, again, like Shay said with the wheat, there are plenty of options for later, the likes of your turples there again. So I'd be just making a risk assessment on that if it's not done. How big is the canopy? What's lodging? rating of the variety and make a decision on that. Like obviously in combination with the amount of nitrogen you've out in it. So there's still plenty of opportunities to get that done if it needs to be done.
So would it be fair to say, Ciaran, that basically all the nitrogen needs to be out in winter barley should have been out already, maybe on the winter barley? It's a priority if it's not done. And then a fungicide to the winter barley is probably the next kind of big one. In terms of diseases, or anything kind of striking you down in Cork in terms of disease levels, Rinco or net blotch, and any of the particular varieties that seem to be a big flashing red light, if you like?
No big flashing red lights. I suppose some of it is predictable enough, I suppose, in terms of Rinco especially, and we've had that sort of Rinco weather recently. Overall, I would say disease levels aren't high. However, we all know with the likes of Rinco, and especially the weather we're having at the moment, you know, and your weaker varieties, your castings, your cassias, those ones, it will come in, and it is in some crops already. So I think getting that first fungicide on just to protect those lower tillers, really, that's what it's all about at this stage. And look, just prioritising that one, I think, Michael.
And Shay, is it a similar situation in the east of the country?
Yeah, quite similar, Michael. As Ciaran says, their disease levels overall are low. That said, there are a couple of nuances out there. I mean, Jayu has quite a bit of mildew in it in places. We've seen quite a few of those crops now are quite advanced at this stage and are actually quite dense. So there's plenty of mildew in those. As Ciaran says, your predictable varieties, likes of cassia, you know, Rinco starting to show up in those quite a bit now. And again, like we were saying, nitrogen is due. The final split of nitrogen is due in most of those crops as well. As is wild oat control. There's very little wild oat control done on winter barley crops up around this part of the world just yet. Okay, so still a few jobs to be done there. Yeah.
As you talk about oats there, in terms of cultivated oats or the standard oat crops out there, from the few I've seen, that they look quite advanced. What are you seeing out there, Shay?
Yeah, again, Michael, it's a mixed bag. Obviously, most of them were sown probably around the middle of October, so they're actually quite similar in growth stages, most of them. Again, a lot will depend on when the first application of fertilizer went on them. The ones that got fertilizer early or on time, should we say, in March, those crops are somewhere between 31 and 32 at this stage. And we're seeing quite a bit of mildew starting to show up in some of them, especially like Husky. Isabel, probably not as bad. But there are crops out there that are, you know, that were only late getting fertilizer. Those are a little bit more backward. And again, similar story to wheat. I mean, they're due to get a growth regulator now, but we need to let the nitrogen kick in on those crops before we put up more stress on them. So again, it's a crop by crop approach. You're just going to have to look at every crop and see what's in front of you.
And is there any priority in terms of disease control with those, Shay?
Yeah, like you say, mildew is the big one on those oat crops at the moment. Some of those really advanced ones now there's quite a bit of mildew in them. So in that case, you're probably looking at putting a bespoke mildewcide in with proline. While it's a good mildewcide, may not be good enough on some of those denser crops. So you're looking at something like Midas or maybe even Turner or Winger, albeit you have the buffer zone to contend with there, the 15-meter buffer zone. So, you know, in some of the crops that are cleaner, maybe Talius as an option there to try and prevent the mildew getting in, or maybe a mix even with cello as well, with the spiroxamine in it, which will help to keep the mildew at bay as well. So there are a few options there to control mildew in the.
So just remind everyone, Jay, it's generally in winter oats, it's a 3 fungicide program.
Yeah.
On it, culminating with the last one at the head kind of coming out. So the first one probably would have been due somewhere in growth stage 31, 32. So
yeah,
are we late for that? And would it mean that when a crop is getting maybe towards 32, that it's maybe back towards a 2 fungicide type scenario?
There are definitely going to be situations like that this year, Michael. Normally you would say, you know, you're looking at 30 or 31 for your first application, at 32 then with your second one, and then as the head is coming out halfway out on your third one. Some of those crops are heading for growth stage 32 already, so farmers are going to be putting out their main split for growth regulators at that stage, and you're putting your fungicide at that stage. So some of those more advanced crops probably will be only 2 spray programs. Some of the more backward ones, it'll probably still be a 3 spray program in some of those. So again, like I say, it's dealing with what you have in front of you. So farmers need to get out, look at the crops, get out, split those stems, because again, what I'm finding in oats, some of them look quite tall, but when you look at the internal growth stages of them, they may not be advanced, or they may be more advanced than what you think. So it's one of those crops this year you really have to get out, do your groundwork, do your walking, split those stems, see where the heads are at, see where the nodes are at, figure out the growth stage, and then formulate a plan.
Okay. And Ciaran, is it a similar situation further south in terms of oats?
Yeah, in terms of what Shay described, would be very similar. Again, like there's very little winter oats sown in certainly around where I live in Cork, and you probably have to go up towards South Wexford before you kind of get into any significant area of oats. Just the autumn didn't allow it. There was a significant area of oats sown there in that window, say in February and into early March. So I think a lot of the oats in the southern half of the country is going to come from those sowings, really. Yeah.
Okay. And what about oilseed rape, Ciaran? That's starting to look really nice, I suppose. It's getting maybe at full bloom or close to full bloom at the moment. Is there any actions needed on any of those crops out there?
Yeah, firstly, oilseed rape is a positive story this year. I think it got in good conditions there after the harvest. Was well established before kind of the weather changed, and that I think winter oilseed rape is looking really, really well this year. As you say, a lot of it is heading towards full flower at the moment. Disease levels so far, we've seen little bits of light leaf spot and that, but generally not too bad. I suppose what you're really watching out for now is Sclerotinia at this stage. So you'd be treating Sclerotinia at early petal fall, but I suppose the crucial thing there is to kind of weigh up the risk. So like if you've had trash or alternative hosts, or I suppose the biggest risk really is based on previous cropping. If you've tight rotations or rape nearby in recent seasons, that they're going to be the higher risk ones. So if you get this type of weather where you're getting kind of dampness at petal fall and those petals are sticking onto the stem and there is infection there, so you have a risk in that case. So you're looking at a bosculid likes of Phelan or Amistar there at early petal fall. That would be the recommended treatment. And then if the risk is high, you may need to repeat that maybe after 3 weeks as well. A lot of growers on newish ground for oilseed rape, and we did obviously see the big area increase, may not need that second one. But again, it's kind of weighing up the risk and treating then or not.
And when you say close for previous crops, do you mean in the same field or within the vicinity?
Within the vicinity, Michael, yeah. The sclerotia, will travel. So I suppose, look, certainly if you have a tight rotation in the same field, that's going to be the highest risk. But still, if you've had oilseed rape in a neighbouring field, that will increase your risk as well. But I think the length of the rotation is going to be the biggest one, really.
Okay. Shay, we don't talk a huge amount about winter beans, but there certainly are some out there. Have you seen any, and how are they coping in these wet conditions?
You're right, Michael. There's not too many of them out there. They are, they're just probably the forgotten crop out there at the moment on a lot of farms, because obviously people are trying to get work done on other winter crops. They're moving all right, Michael. I suppose they're probably a little bit more tolerant of the wet conditions than probably the other crops that are out there, albeit, look, they don't want to be sitting in water either. Not starting to see any chocolate spot just yet, but I'm guessing that in the next week or so, we'll probably see chocolate spots starting to appear into those crops. So they're probably going to need an application of a fungicide at that stage, rather than letting it develop and trying to control it later on. But for the most part, they're doing okay, but again, there's not that many of them around. So I suppose they're probably a crop that's in the back of most people's mind out that they're trying to get work done on other crops.
So if you see a bit of chocolate spot, do you attack it or do you hang on and wait and see?
No, you need to get in straight away. If you see a chocolate spot there, you need to get out with a fungicide, be it Signum or Amistar and tebuconazole, and you're probably going to leave a lattice here where you're allowed one application later in the season. So you're probably looking at Signum or the Amistar sort of tebuconazole sort of mix in those early timings.
Okay. And I suppose, Shay, the majority of beans probably would have been planted in the springtime in that lovely conditions there in February.
Yeah.
What sort of area do you think was put in, and what do you think of them coming up through the ground at the moment?
It's a good question, Michael. There's probably, we look like we're going to be certainly higher than what we were last year. I mean, there was a target probably at the beginning of the year to put in somewhere in the region of about 14,000 hectares of proteins. That includes winter beans, spring beans, and spring peas. So we're probably not there. There's still, from what I'm hearing in the northeast, there's still quite a bit of seed still on farms, not planted yet. So there's, while that target is there, at this stage we're probably going to struggle to make it. The crops that are sown were coming through the ground about a week or 10 days ago. Most of those are looking okay at the moment, albeit listening to reports, there's quite a few crops got no herbicide after sowing. So, they're really limited now in what they can apply at this stage. They're looking at really as a Basagran type situation. But again, you're going to have to look at your weed spectrum and that and see, is Basagran going to cover the weeds that you have in your field? So those could be a little bit messy later on as we go through the season. So we'll just have to wait and see how they come through. From the point of view of bean weevil, I was looking at a few crops the other day, not seeing any bean weevil damage just yet. But again, it's something that growers need to keep an eye on and see if there's any of those sort of bite marks on the edges of the leaves. And if they're bad enough, starting from the hedge, working out across the headland out into the middle of the field, if they're starting to see a lot of damage done, well then they probably need to give it a treatment of a pyrethroid. Not for what they're not going to eat the leaves, but they're going to little larvae in the stems, which can obviously affect the growth of the crop later on. So just something to keep an eye on at the moment. And like you say, I'm not seeing any yet, but as the weather warms up and we get later into April, they start to move then.
Sure. I suppose to you, Shay, but also Ciaran as well, I get your as a comment on it. In terms of the, Shay, you mentioned that there is still some beans in sheds waiting to be planted. Is it too late now to start planting beans? I mean, God, if the weather dries up, and we seen this back in, I think it was 2018, where beans were sowed very late into April, and we got a drought almost straight afterwards, and they weren't good afterwards, if you know what I mean. And there might be a couple of other maybe crops in that. Is it too late for wheat now? Is it too late for oats even now?
Yes, it's a very good, it's a predicament, Michael. I mean, if you have the seed there, what do you do? And you're right, 2018 is a good barometer for what happened in that year. And again, it was a double whammy in that season, whereby we were late planting and then we got hit with a drought later on, which really, really affected all those late sown crops. And I suppose even if we get everything right and season goes on and we get a sort of whatever normal season will be, I mean, you have to bear in mind the wheat, beans or oats, you're probably going to be end up harvesting those late in September. And that's far from ideal because your days are short and it can be a struggle of time to get harvesters going in those fields at that time of the year. So it is something to be very, very conscious of, that if you are going to sow wheat, beans or oats at this stage, it's very, very late for them. But some people, maybe through rotation restrictions or whatever it may be, may decide that they need to go on with them. And I suppose another thing just to bear in mind, if you're going with, say, the likes of oats or beans, I mean, at this stage, if you're putting in spring wheat or spring oats, they're candidates really for the straw chopping scheme. And I think trying to save straw off those crops at late September is a very difficult job. So it'll be certainly one that I'd be considering if they're going to put in wheat or oats at this stage.
Ciaran, would it be a similar comment down south?
Yeah, just a comment on the beans. Firstly, I mean, there's very little, if any, hardly winter beans the weather didn't allow, but like the majority of them went in, I would say, in that February, March slot, and they're looking really well, arguably too well. I suppose every farmer probably compensated a bit for the crows, and for whatever reason, all the bean crops I've been in lately have really high plant populations, which can be a positive, but can be a negative as well. But anyway, we have what we have. I
the
think
saying goes,
really
Ciaran, I'd rather be looking at them than looking for them.
Well, there's a little bit of that, certainly. Yeah. No, it can challenge us with chocolate spot and lodging later, but look, we've had good yields from a high plant population. But I think that's just a comment, really. In terms of the sowing date of beans, like the research would show that beans sown in April can yield as well as March sown beans. However, the risk of something going wrong is higher. And just like Shay said, if you run into a dry period later in the season, that's where the risk obviously happens. So I think the field that you're sowing it in and the location is a big factor. If you're on light soil, that risk is much, much higher than somebody on a heavier soil. So I think they're the factors weighing up whether you go or not in that scenario.
Okay, so target beans if you have any left to sow, target in the heaviest field that you have, and if it's only light fields left, maybe consider something else maybe instead. Is that what you're saying? I
think so, yeah. And then it obviously is going to depend on when the weather shapes up. Like, sure. Certainly getting into the back end of April is a non-runner, really.
So, Ciaran, where are we at in terms of overall planting, say, of the remaining cereals of barley? Is it half done yet, do you think?
I don't think so. No, for spring barley, no, I wouldn't think so. It's very hard to gauge, but just talking to farmers and talking to the seed trade and agri merchants and that, there's a lot of seed in sheds. And like the little bits of windows we've had, haven't been wide enough in the sense that ground just hasn't had that chance to dry out properly. And then we've seen some of the consequences of that with some of the earlier sown ones. Some of those on lighter ground look really well, but there's a lot of spring barley fields you're going into now, and they're, just patchy, bits of headlands missing, and that's far from ideal. In terms of the overall percentage, it's difficult like to put a percentage, but it's less than 50 anyway. It certainly is less than 50.
Okay, and I suppose farmers have to, no matter what to do, they still have to wait for that ground to dry out. But I suppose it does dry that a little bit quicker. But it needs to soak, I suppose, underneath. It's probably the bigger thing, isn't it?
Yeah, for me, like I look today, we're all getting worried at this stage, but like the conditions trump everything. Like if it goes even, no matter how late it goes, like just getting the conditions right for me is the biggest thing. And like, I mean, the whole landscape can change in a week. Like we have, with the equipment we have now, 4 or 5 good planting days, and the countryside is transformed. So that's the other side of it.
And Shay, up this side of the world, is it a similar kind of situation, or is there a bit more planted than down in Cork?
I would say, Michael, in the lighter soils around the Thigh, Carlow, there's maybe even the North Wexford, there's quite a bit of done. And traveling along the Slaney a couple of weeks ago, it's a lot of barley sown in that Slaney Valley as well on some of those lighter malting sites, and that's up and looking quite well at the moment. But similar to Ciaran, I mean, on the heavier soils, and as you move into the northeast and northwest, very little barley sown, and I'd say the vast majority of spring barley that's to be sown in those areas is still in the bag. So a lot of work to be done, Michael. And I suppose the other thing just to bear in mind, we are in middle April now. 1,000 grain weights on seed are high this year, so guys are really going to have to start increasing seed rates to try and get those really get those tiller numbers up and try and get to 1,000 shoots come harvest time. So you're looking at seed rates probably somewhere north of 12 stone an acre for some of those bigger 1,000 grain varieties. So farmers really need to check and see what's on the bags and adjust the seed rates for those.
So Shay, that's the old money. Equate that to the new money in terms of plants per metre squared or seeds per metre squared and kg.
So you're looking at planting about 350 to 360 seeds per metre squared to establish somewhere north of 300 plants per square metre. So you're looking at somewhere in the region of about 190 to 200 kilos a hectare if you're setting the drill. And it's just, to bear in mind that we are getting late into the sowing season now. Plants won't have the same capacity to form tillers as those earlier sown crops will. So you're trying to compensate that by putting more seed into the soil to give you a chance to hit those targets that we've talked about before.
And Ciaran, as it's getting on a little bit late, would it be the recommendation to try and put as much of the N, P and K into the soil at sowing as possible? Yep,
certainly. P and K is a no-brainer. Certainly, that's a done deal. I suppose we would traditionally, obviously, get as much nitrogen then in as the kind of compound would allow in terms of that flexibility. There's certainly a strong argument for later sown crops to put more of that nitrogen into the seed bed. If you're placing, the only area you need to be careful of is if you're using urea, and if you're placing alongside the seed, you'd probably limit that to probably 70-75 kilos. But we saw in 2018 where people put almost all the nitrogen into the seed bed, and I think that can work really well just to work it in. And look, that's just in anticipation of drier weather that may or may not happen, but certainly increasing the nitrogen in the seed bed is definitely something to look at from now on, I would think. Yeah.
So you'd probably go to maybe 60 or 70% of the total, Ciaran, would you?
Yeah, with no issue with that, yeah. No issue at all.
Okay. So Ciaran, I suppose the other one then is the last kind of, I suppose, a few other kind of crops, and Shay, I'm going to come back to you on potatoes in a second, but there's a couple of other crops there, the likes of maize and beet, and I'm assuming or presuming there's none of that planted at all so far. Is that, is it, there'll certainly be lots of it sown again this year, but is that an alternative option for farmers out there, do you think?
Yes and no, I suppose. Look, the area of maize and beet has remained kind of, stable enough in recent times. And the reason for that is there's a certain market available for it, So look, any tillage farmer that hasn't grown maize or beet before, I mean, you need to have a market, you need to have it sold the day you sow it. Like, the risks are just too high at this stage in terms of the cost of both crops, so growing it on spec just isn't a runner. So I think that's obviously the first thing. Secondly, in terms of those that are sowing, date-wise, that wouldn't be a concern yet, really. I think the key thing for both crops is high soil temperatures, getting them sown, and then, I suppose not having a setback, really. So I wouldn't be really concerned in terms of sowing date just yet, for maize or beet, Michael, no.
Okay, grand. And finally, Shay, potatoes, is there any much in at all? Are people well behind, or is it still pretty okay?
We're still, I'd say, Michael, for the most part, we're still okay. We're probably starting to move on to the later side of the start of it. But that said, most growers now are well kitted out that they can do a lot of work in a very short space of time. There is some early rooster in, and obviously your earlies like Queens and Premier and stuff like that, they're pretty much done at this stage. I suppose talking to a few growers there in the last couple of days, they are starting to get a little bit concerned that, certainly on some of that heavier ground, that it is going to take it a while to dry out. And again, similar to what Ciaran was mentioning earlier on, I mean, soil conditions trump everything. Wait until the soils are right before you start going in, because potatoes are one crop that are very unforgiving of planting into poor conditions. You're going to affect root growth, you're going to affect nitrogen or nutrient uptake, and you're going to affect final yield afterwards. So wait until the soils are dry at depth, not just on the top. Don't go when you see the top of the ground white. Let it soak, let it dry. It'll cut down on your cost of establishment, but it'll also improve the yield potential of the crop as well.
I suppose this year, Shay, was a difficult year, I suppose, might be the best way of describing it in terms of growing potatoes and making any money out of it. Do you think the area is going to be down this year?
The indications are, Michael, and it's a very dangerous thing to say, particularly at this stage, the indications are, there are a few people going to exit the market for different reasons. There are a couple of supply chains that have closed for a couple of people. So it looks like the area is going to be back. That said, it might be back in one area and it might be up in another. We don't know. We may wait and see. Certainly, it looks at this stage the likes of your typical rooster, Kerr's Pink, home, or Golden Wonders, those types of crops will probably be back. They may or may not be compensated by guys moving into processing. But again, it depends on a lot of variables between not just your market, but also land availability as well, which is also coming into question.
Guys, look, that's great. It's a great update. There certainly seems to be an awful lot of work out there that farmers need to kind of catch up on, whether it's spring planting crops and getting those in, or dealing with the agronomy on some of the winter crops that are already there. So farmers are certainly going to be busy whenever that weather takes up. So guys, listen, thanks again. And look, I'm going to maybe ask you to come back in maybe a couple of weeks' time, and we'll touch base again to see where crops are then.
No problem, Michael. Thanks a million.
So that's it for this week. And my thanks to Shay and Ciaran for joining me on the show. Keep an eye out for the local Teagasc crop walks coming up in April and in early May throughout the country. There are 2 walks, one in Carlow today, April the 13th, and in Athy on April the 18th. These walks will go through the economy needs of crops in 2023. For more details, go to teagasc.ie/events. Finally, don't forget, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.